Discover a transformative journey into the kingdom of heaven. Following the initial publication, the author dives deeper with two insightful follow-up books. Ever felt disconnected from God even in worship? Explore how God's unconventional ways can transform your life. How can you align with divine plans, avoiding distractions? Find answers in The Kingdom of Heaven on Earth and The 3, Illuminating Christian Truths and Prophetic Practices. Unlock profound insights guiding you toward a deeper connection with God. Don't miss out. Dive into this enlightening exploration today. Click the link on the caption to get your copy.
Fair. That wasn't loud. Just book fair. Let's take it a little higher. Just book fair.
Stories dancing with a vibrant flair. Find the magic at the Just Book Fair. Turn the page, feel the power ignite. Words alive, breaking into the light. Stories call under skies so rare. Feel the rhythm at the Just Book Fair. Authors weave.
Good morning, welcome to Searching the Heart. That was the Just Book Fair. I was just at the Just Book Fair, and it's a program organized by a group of authors within the Just area here. I was invited by a friend who I've known for a while, involved with NIFES, involved with students in the campus, and he invited me and I went, and I hope next year I'll be able to go again, okay, so that we'll have a better experience of some of the talks and some of the ideas that have been shared there. Well, books have been a part of my life for a very long time, and I see books generally, literally, as guardians of civilization, because they literally open the door for me personally into civilization itself. You know, you have a different view of the world when you enter the pages of books. Most often you live in some kind of a parochial environment, not knowing what the world is all about. But books literally open a door, you know, and they help you to explore. Somebody was talking about that today, and she traveled around through books. And it is very true of books. I remember the first book I read. I was a very small child then, maybe about 7, 8, 9, 10. I can't really remember, but it was a book my uncle left lying around called Nightmare's Child. Okay? Now, very strange, I did not know. Of course, the cover of the book really said, okay, this book is a horror kind of, you know, really not for children at least. But, you know, I was curious, I had nothing doing, so I picked the book and I started reading. And it was about this young child that was led by spirits, or by his spirit. He had a disability, and because of that disability, he grew up in a rough environment, was not really cared for, and got in contact with this spirit. Okay, the spirit was an evil spirit called Mr. Harriman. Okay. And this Mr. Harriman kept on telling him things that he should do, and kept on leading him to behave more mature than he should be. And at the end, those of you who have read that novel know how it ended, Nightmare's Child. And maybe it was preparing me to be who I am today, okay? I became a pastor. And in the way I do my ministry, it's quite different from the other ministries, popular ministries, especially here in Africa, okay, that a child must go through the normal process, educational process, taking care of the cognitive, the psychomotor, and affective parts of the child's mind. When you overemphasize one part, it leads to a lopsided growth. And this is why I've come to understand, and that is why my ministry for the first is called GROW, GROW, even before I became the pastor of CRMI here. And that's why I focused on the youth, and up to today, I take every opportunity I have to try to help the young people. Most times in bringing up young people, yes, you have to deal with their the parts of them. You have to be, it will appeal to what they like, what they want. Video games, parties, music, all that. But sometimes the pain in studying, to discipline themselves and to read is very important. It helps them to avoid a lot of things which we see is coming up again in our time and age. And so this is what that book taught me. After then, I was able to read other books. Like there was a little lull because I like I said, I didn't really. Actually, I was a peculiar person. I didn't really jump into the book, the reading culture, like a lot of my friends. A lot of my friends would tell, okay, they've read Hadley Chase. I know those days Hadley Chase was the most popular novel. Okay, they keep on talking about the different titles in Hadley Chase, and you know, it was strange to me because I was never really into reading. But when I encountered a few topics I liked, like some works by Shakespeare, I remember reading a book by Shakespeare, some of the collection of stories by Shakespeare. I also read Encounter and read also Roots, okay, and also was able to read The Third Reach. And these 4 books kind of gave me a leap into civilization. They practically opened the door for me into civilization and into the world I had not known before. You know, that's why I say books are guardians of civilization. They hold the gate. They open the gate to civilization for us. And it's a wonderful thing. And that's why I was there today. I'm going to take a few minutes of your time today to talk about books, to talk about the art of writing, the history of books, and a few issues that concern us today as people who are into education, and how civilization is affected by education, and people who write. And I hope that at the end of it we'll come to a realization of where civilization will go in this light.
To acknowledge also, because this has to do with literacy, the Commissioner for Information, Right Honorable Joy Lawyer Ramnath, MNI, and the Commissioner for Education, Honorable Dr. Kachalom Pyamgyang, which I've learned she has sent a representative. And our keynote speaker this morning, Mr. Langdon Tumchama, a friend and author and influencer. Thank you. The father, somebody I consider as a father, Reverend Dr. Danjuma Bian, who has found time to be here. He'll be making some few remarks after the keynote. And then I call her Mama Books, the head of the branch for community and sustained by vision. It was actually a burden that was born, you know, I borne this burden for time and a lot of other friends. For years, I have had the lament. I don't know, many of you have had that too. The lament that say young people no longer read. How many of you have that lament around you? Say young people don't read. But my reality tells a different story. I've seen students on campus carrying books like treasures, not the academic books, regular books to read. I have seen young men and women reading to understand their world, to find God, to find purpose. What we lacked was not readers, but platforms, community, and access. And in the city that has known pain, like Jos, division, and fear, we dare to respond, not with arms, but with books. Not with noise, but with knowledge. Not with profit, but with purpose. That is the spirit behind the Just Book Fair. My story, and I can say that our story, I was raised in a village, I told them yesterday, where there were no libraries, you know, but there was curiosity. I learned to read first with the Bible. Don't worry, my father was a missionary, so, and Masubushara and Ada. So I learned to read, that's what I used to learn to read. And then a Hausa novel, Magana Jariche, talk is business. These weren't just stories, they were bridges. They carried me from isolation into imagination, from silence into purpose. I stumbled on theological book my father has hidden in an old box. And those books shaped my calling, from village boy to an author of about 45 books today. So my life is a testimony of what happens when a young person is handed a book and shown its power. I remember in the village then I would go to the rocks, you know, in the bush. Victor's book launch is coming soon. Writing a book is difficult, so everywhere I go I respect authors. And I would like to acknowledge our special guest, the Governor of Plateau State, the Commissioner for Education, Commissioner for Information, our host, the National Library, Jos, and then the Plateau State Library. Thank you all for all the amazing work and for allowing us to work together to push the message of books. The topic is books as catalyst. The year is 1789. The place is Britain. For the first time in human history, there is a revulsion amongst the human population that slavery was abominable. The amazing man Thomas Clarkson has been able to revive the hearts of people in England and make them realize the evil of slavery. A significant percentage of British people were all of a sudden revolting against this. But there was one problem. He alone could not do this. So they formed a friend group called the Clapham Sect. The Clapham Sect was a group of evangelical believers who met at the house of one of their members, Granville Sharp. They met often every Sunday. They prayed, hung out together, ate food, knew their families, got married to each other. But they were passionate about one thing too. They were passionate about ending slavery. In Parliament, they had a guy whose name was William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce was their spokesman. He was able to push hard and eventually sponsor a bill that was supposed to end the slave trade. But for the slave trade to end, it wasn't just going to end. There were people who were benefiting from slavery. In fact, at that point, more than half of the people in Parliament were people who had interest in slave islands like Jamaica, Saint Domingo, the West Indies, Brazil, and several other countries. So they weren't just going to go down without a fight. So they decided to fight. But there was one way that the battle could be won. And that way was something called an inquiry. An inquiry is something that Parliament does when there's a bill before it. They set up an investigation that is supposed to go back, check the whole process, check the whole systems, and then offer recommendations. But there was still one problem again. That problem was that for an inquiry to work, you needed witnesses. You needed people to come and stand on the stand and to give their own perspective, to give their own view of what was going on. And because it was slavery, the people who needed to testify were supposed to be black people. Not just black people, black slaves. And here was the bigger problem. The bigger problem was that as at that time, barely 5% of the people in Britain were actually black, and out of that 5%, barely 2% were actually free men. And beyond that, very, very few knew how to read and write. So what it meant is that this was a deadlock. There was no hope again. Can a person who is illiterate talk? No. Can a person who doesn't know how to speak English talk? No. So Thomas Clarkson, the man who was gathering witnesses, went around for months
for years, gathering witnesses, trying to get people. He needed just one black person who could talk for black people. He needed just one individual who could share his testimony of the problems he has encountered as a slave. Because at this point, white people were actually saying that slavery was a good thing. They were actually saying that it was God's mandate for them to enslave black people because black people did not have the capability to think independently. They were saying that black people were below the rung. It was God's intention for them to be enslaved. But you know what? We couldn't respond because we couldn't speak their language. Then the year 1789 came. The year 1789 came. Out of nowhere, a certain man called Oluwada Ekwano published a book. Who was Eluado Ekwano? Eluado Ekwano was a slave man that was picked in present-day Nigeria, taken through the transatlantic slavery, passed through the Middle Passage, reached England, was sold as a slave, and he lived there, but the guy was just too smart. As his masters were talking, he was speaking the languages. As his masters were communicating and selling him, he was speaking the words. Eventually, he gathered enough money, bought his freedom, and went ahead to live in England. And then, for many years later, he went ahead to write his own book. And he titled the book, The Narrative of the Former Slave, Eluado Ekwano, or Gustavus Vassa. That book was a revolution on its own. You know what it did? It completely changed the landscape. It altered all the calculation of the slave owners, because for the first time, there was someone who was describing slavery, and he wasn't describing it theoretically. This was a person who had gone through all the process. He was describing how they came to his village, how they came to his house, how they came to his people, how they kidnapped him, how they brought him through all this process, the suffering he went through, the pain he went through, all the pains and all the things that he has endured as a former slave. He wrote them down in a book. And you know what happened? That book became a bestseller instantly. Within a year, 1,800 copies were sold. Instantly, Ekwano became a sensation in all of England. And his testimony fostered and made the British realize the enormity of slavery. Folks, in 1807, slavery was banned in the British Empire. If Eluado Ekwano had not written that book, we can actually say slavery could not have been banned.
Okay, writing as an ancient art, okay? Writing as an ancient art. Now, writing was not something that came to human beings naturally. It was nothing. It wasn't something that they actually could have created or understood by themselves. And that is why when you look at the history, the known history of human beings, it stretches. Some people stretch it down to 200,000 years. I don't want to go that far, but I will accept the Neolithic, the accepted Neolithic dates of about 13,000, okay, 15,000, 13,000 years BC, okay. So about 13,000 BC, about 11,000 BC, those were the times human beings who began to create Neolithic, the Neolithic civilization, began to engage in agriculture, began to engage in building, we're no longer living in caves, okay, that was the time. So, but when you go beyond that, of course, people will tell you about 100,000 years, probably. Okay, and this is what I have explained in my previous podcast on the background of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 down to chapter 11. Okay, so this is what it is. Okay, so writing didn't come to them as natural. That is why the records given to us in the book of Genesis, especially those 11 chapters, are literally oral tradition. Okay, and this oral tradition is not only common to the Jews, but it is a Mesopotamian phenomenon. Okay, also found in the Epic of Gilgamesh and other tablets, Babylonian tablets. You will find the same thing. And some of those Babylonian tablets including the Epic of Gilgamesh, were recorded on tablets of clay. Okay, they were recorded on tablets of clay, which was one of the first ways human beings began to write. Okay, and this was far into human civilization, where we read in the Bible records for us that humans began to come together and say, let us build, let us create a civilization that will make us great. Okay, meaning, of course, that before then human beings were nothing but slaves. Some will tell you that that is what happened. Okay, human beings were slaves too, in their own midst, slaves to the gods. Okay, so that is what we see in that history, that alternative history that we have. Okay, and of course the Bible also lends to that and says, yes, the sons of God came and they interbred with human beings, and there were repercussions to that. Of course, it blames that for the flood and other things that happened during that time. And so you find those stories coming up, and of course many people will agree that those were oral traditions passed down from generation to generation and recorded for us in the Bible, though a lot of it, like from Genesis chapter 1 right to chapter 9, had some scientific facts. I've always insisted on that. Okay, had scientific facts, especially verse 1 of chapter 1 to 31, that built the background or the foundation of whatever we know has been corroborated by science today. Okay, so this is the idea. So writing started around the Babylonian Empire within that very time, about 4000 BC. Okay, 4000 BC, between 5000, 4000, 3000 BC, of course, is accepted. Writing began at that time, especially on tablets of clay. It continued to progress into even writing on papyrus, which was popular among the Egyptians, and writing on stone. Okay, and one civilization that got into writing with stones is, of course, the Jews. They progressed into writing on stone. The Ten Commandments were written on stone, of course, written directly by God Himself on stone. And this is what we continue to see. Okay, while the Egyptians, of course, wrote on papyrus. Okay, and that was the beginning of the invention of paper. Okay, so very long ago, up to about 5,000 years before Christ, 5,000 years, 3,000 years BC, 4,000 years BC, writing started. But cumulatively, it's about 5,000 to 6,000 years right now. Okay, so this is the thing. The dates are not set in stone. They are flexible because we don't know exactly when those dates are. So writing now developed, okay, for the first by religious clerics. Okay, the people who founded the little religions of that time, they wrote to protect the records, what they believed were their interactions with God. And of course, little stories that explain to them the reality that they thought they knew. Okay, so they wrote all these little things on things like clay, like stone, the Ten Commandments on stone, and on papyrus. So this is what we see. Okay, it was later on, far later on, right up to about 1000 or 1500 BC, that the kings began to write. They began to copy the religious clerics and the patriarchs to write, okay, to record their own deeds. If they succeeded to conquer one nation or the other, they would write it down. And we know that this was very popular among especially the Babylonians, around late 1005 BC, they wrote of their great deeds, okay? And of course, the Assyrians who wrote on stone and clay pillars is very popular. Stone and clay pillars, okay? And this is what happened, okay? And this continued and continued until it became more organized. Within the time of writing, now patriarchs controlled the writings, okay, using monuments to mark places for the sake of remembrance. If they built an altar, gave a sacrifice to God, they would mark it for the sake of remembrance. Jacob slept on the way to Haran. He put a monument and slept there, where he thought he saw a vision from God, and he marked the place, okay? And sometimes those monuments included writings, okay? Records of what happened to those patriarchs during those times. Now this formed the basis of whatever religious culture that took place. And so as this progressed, of course, these nations became organized kingdoms, and the Israelites also, they became an organized kingdom. And through this, there was very little writing, except for in their own peculiar story, it was the prophets, the school of the prophets and the priests that perpetuated the writing culture, because it was important for them to record the laws. God had written for them the Ten Commandments on the tablet of stone, and it was important for them to perpetuate this culture by writing out the other laws, the fringe laws that Moses had brought to them. And so they wrote these things out on scrolls. Of course, the writing on scrolls was said to be a very late adventure, right into closer into probably in the intertestamental period, when they were in exile in Babylon, when the nation of Israel was taken captive, right into the 1st century AD. Okay, so they started writing and copying these laws on rolls of skin, of leather. Okay. And this was how they continued to do that. And a group of clerics that were called the scribes, they were responsible for doing this work. They copied and they wrote down the history of Israel on scrolls and passed them from generation to generation. Of course, because of this evidence, we know that it must have started right as early as about 1500 BC, during the times of the kings. The kings recorded their deeds. Of course, the scribes were also far more responsible for this, because when you see the narrative, you see that it was recorded in bias of these religious beliefs. And that is why we know it was the scribes that primarily did the writing, not the serfs of the king, or people who were appointed to do so in the palace of the kings. No, they were writing it for religious purposes, to record what was going on, because Israel was peculiarly a setup that was grown and nurtured through religion. Okay, so religion was a very important source in the discovery and perpetuation of writing. Okay, especially with the Israelites. Okay, although the kings later on also had their own scribes, especially some of the pagan kings like the Nebuchadnezzar himself, and all that. And some of the Jews like Daniel became officers in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and the court of Cyrus, okay, the court of Artaxerxes, Jews, various different Jews served within these, and they were able to record for us in the books of Nehemiah, Ezra, in the book of Esther, and of course Daniel and so on. So this is what we see about the history and development of writing, okay, from the biblical point of view, okay, mostly. Now, one of the evidences we have about the development of organized education during that time, about 1500 BC through to about 1000 BC, okay, right up to about 400 BC, all these things continue. This was the school of prophets, as supervised by Prophet Elijah, Prophet Elisha, Micaiah, right through down to the time of Daniel, and right through to the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. Okay, so these were structures that held up throughout that time. Okay, and of course we see, like we said, with the pagan kings, we saw the wise men that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego became part of when they were taken captive into the land of Babylon. Okay, so we have all these recorded evidences. Okay, now that period was thus. Okay, but as we go forward, we'll discover that, of course, the Bible does not give us this detail. It begins for us by telling us how the Babylonian astronomers and astrologers dealt with the issues brought to them by the kings, and of course that Daniel was part of them, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. But after then, we have other books like the Deuterocanonical books, like the Book of Maccabees, that are not canonical books in some denominations, of course, maybe canonical books in other denominations. Maccabees 1 and 2, okay, and other books, Daniel, Bel and the Dragon, they tell us a little more into what was happening during that time. And this was the period where the Greeks had conquered the world, okay, led by first of all Alexander the Great. And of course, through this more secular history, we know that period heralded the rise of Greek philosophy and the Greek philosophers, and the rise of people like Socrates. Okay, Socrates himself was a philosopher that was not accepted by the Greeks, even though he was one of the pioneers and one of Greek philosophy, of foundational Greek philosophy. Okay, he was not accepted by them, and he was executed for corrupting youth because of his intellectual program that he was indulged in. Of course, he was succeeded by people like Plato. Of course, we know one of the popular works of Plato on Atlantis. Plato was not only a philosopher, he was a historian, he was a storyteller, and many other things, okay? And we know about Aristotle. And all these people were heralded the great time of the Greeks, where Greek philosophy became a thing, the Greek civilization blossomed, and actually midwifed the maturity of human civilization. The Jewish traditions, the Egyptian and Jewish traditions and Babylonian traditions build the foundation, of course, and the Greeks actually midwife or catalyze the maturity of human civilization. And it was at this time, after the Greeks, when the Romans had taken over, but Greek philosophy was still very relevant, and that Jesus Christ appeared on the scene. And of course, we know that this was a time of a lot of scholasticism, okay, monasticism, and the Jews were not left out, the Greeks were not left out either. And this was the maturity of human civilization, as it were. And of course, writing was a norm. By that time, writing had become a norm. It was a normal thing. It was used in trade. schools were established, although most of the schools were, of course, religious schools, okay, especially in the Jewish context, and of course also in the Greek context. But of course, the Greeks tended more into secular studies. But of course, most of it was founded within the religious context. So this is what was going on, and human civilization had matured. So this was the foundation that was laid for the Christian monasticism that will develop from there. Once the Christian movement had gotten a foundation and grown, what is called Christian monasticism, okay, and scholarship developed after the time of Constantine, okay, and most of the foundational doctrines of the church were developed within this very context. People were allowed to debate doctrinal foundations, to engage in scholarly debates and philosophical debates, and this was the time also that some of the Greek philosophy that had laid the foundation in the majority of human civilization, kind of affected the church, okay, was tested within the doctrine of the church. And up to today, we see aspects of it still in the church. Because it was not everything that was wrong, of course. The Greeks had control of a lot of the scholarly language, a lot of the scholarly ideas, the ways of understanding life. And so these were used, okay? As you see even in the popular theory of recapitulation from Irenaeus. When you talk about Arianism, the popular heresy, all those were from there. They had to debate all these issues. To establish the very person of Christ, they had to debate with the Greek philosophy. And this was what was going on. At this time, it was normal. Writing had become so writing was normal, okay? Writing was normal in this time, the 1st century AD. At that time, it was normal. And this was the period that Christ chose to come. And of course, hence the writing of the gospel. At that time, when you read the book of Luke and his subsequent book of Acts, you will see that scholarship was fairly established at that time, and the approach of Luke, himself an educated person, okay, was very clear that at that time it was normal. Education was a normal thing, scholarship was a normal thing, okay, and this continued right through into the first 300 years of the church, right through to the about 600 AD, the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire, right through to about the 1000 AD. Okay, of course, within that time also Islam came up, and Islam too was a very scholarly religion also, based most of what its doctrine and its development on the recording of the Quran. Although in the case of Islam, it was more on the side of memorization rather than recording. But of course, we know, of course, one of the things that was talked about today in the book fair was the issue of also the very deep monastic tradition of Islam in the heritage of Baghdad and other areas within the Middle East. Okay, I've heard of even one in Morocco, I think. Yes. So those were different stages of the development of writing and of education. And of course, one important thing happened within this time. As Islam was taking over in the Middle East, of course we know before Islam, Christianity had established a very, very deep-rooted monastic tradition in the school of Alexandria and Constantinople itself, in Carthage. And it was a very academic and very, very scholastic tradition. Okay, and this scholastic tradition was what midwifed the growth of Christianity even in the West. Okay, but there were disadvantages to this tradition, and this is one thing that we should continue to look at. What was the disadvantage? The same thing that affects us even today, all over the world, but most peculiarly in Africa. What was the disadvantage of this monastic and scholastic tradition? Disadvantage was that it did not appeal to the ordinary people. And this was why it did not really sink in. And this is one of the reasons that most scholars will give for the fall of the Christian tradition, or the loss of the territory of the Christian territory, mostly in North Africa and of course in the Middle East. And it instead moved westward into Europe, okay, and after hundreds and hundreds of years of refinement and all that, it took hold in Western tradition, okay, and later also fell. And this is what happened. It progressed actually. They did fail. Yes, Christianity fell, but writing and education progressed to another level. And what was that? The Renaissance. The Renaissance. The Renaissance was a very, very important event or series of events within the Western civilization. And this was the critique of the Bible. Okay, certain German scholars began to critique the Bible. Okay, and throughout Europe, there arose a growing awareness that religion was sort of, in their own thinking, was slowing down progress. And so they began to believe that they should begin to critique, not just accept every religious dogma, but begin to critique this religious dogma. Criticism of scripture. That is what happened during the years of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, some would call it. Okay, discoveries by people like Galileo, like Leonardo da Vinci, like Shakespeare. Within all that period, within the 14th century, right down to the 18th century, these took place, and there was the critique of scripture at that time. Because scripture, now we need to understand one very basic thing. Scripture, the Bible, was the best known document at that time that described any form of enlightenment, any form of education. Okay, it was accepted as the, of course, today theologians will call it the queen of the sciences. Okay, it was accepted as the queen of the sciences, and because of that, it was everything was interpreted based on the foundation of scripture. And so in that period of the Enlightenment, of course the Renaissance, they began to, scholars began to raise questions. Again, just like Arius did in the beginning of the establishment of the church led by the Emperor Constantine. Again, this time, not trying to have any theological debate as Arius was trying to do. No, this time we're actually questioning with some form of authority behind it, brought about by the discovery of science itself. Okay, the establishment of the scientific method in medical areas, in astronomy, and in the arts. Okay, and so this was what was going on at this time, called the Renaissance, and this heralded the development of modern society. Okay, of course, within that same period, the Reformation had already taken place. Okay, so all these things were happening at that time. Technology had changed the way things were being done. Of course, by the Bible was the normal interpretations to biblical texts began to be questioned, and this was also the foundation of it. And of course, to the detriment of the church, to the more dogmatic philosophy of the church, but to the betterment of science and to secularization of education itself. So this is what happened. Now, this is a very critical time, and we have to take time to look very, very carefully at this thing, at what was happening at this time. Okay, up to today, there is the conflict that developed during the time of the Renaissance still affects us up to today, because, of course, of this difficulty of human beings to relate mystical concepts, okay, to scientific concepts. And this dialogue and sometimes conflict is still raging. It is more of a conflict than a dialogue. Some of us are trying to make it a dialogue, but it has never been a dialogue. It has always been a conflict. And of course, very treated with a lot of intolerance within most established denominations. Okay. Of course, the Catholic Church being the mother of all churches, of course, having already gone through all those debates within itself, what I'm talking about now actually occurred within the context of the Catholic Church. And so may seem to be more advanced than other churches. But that conflict is still going on, and silently people are changing sides within those two sides. Those who tend to be a little more scientific, those who tend to be rather more spiritual or more mystical. And so all these things are taking place, all these conflicts and dialogues are taking place. Yet, this is what has been happening, okay? And this gave birth to the birth of modern education, okay? And in fact, modern education took one road and religious education took another road to make it more clear, okay? That is the fact of the matter. This historical fact is still a present fact. And though some of us scholars, of course there are many all over the world, that are leading the charge on the Christian part to explain science through the Bible, okay? So many of them are there, but they are not mainline scientists. They are fringe scientists. They are not considered authoritative. A lot of them are persecuted, pushed to the background of the mainline science world, okay? So this is the truth of it, okay? Anybody who wants to tell you today that it has been a dialogue and a peaceful process and everything is going on fine, is lying to you, okay? Of course, some people love to jump at these things because they believe it's a way of making money and making a name, okay? So this is the problem, okay? But it is the time, as you have, if you've been a follower of my podcasts, yeah, you would know that I've been trying to push this view, this position very silently, because it is in my nature not to. I do not think there's any dichotomy between creation and science. Of course, science is just the discovery or the scrutiny of what has already been created. Okay, and I've made many points. Like most things that scientists make or discover are already there, and they are just being expanded upon. Many people have believed this. We're still talking about the Renaissance that took place about the 14th century through to the 17th century. We have mentioned that, of course, the focus was to first of all criticize the Bible, okay, the historicity of the Bible, do some textual criticism. You know, for the first time they were allowed to question, okay, the popular dogma, okay, the writing of the Bible itself, okay, the artistic format of the Bible. It was no longer considered the Word of God, the literal Word of God, but to be criticized, analyzed like any other historical document. Okay, even the historicity was up for grabs, and this was the first time this happened within this period of time. And of course, it was a win for secular education, and of course, Christianity was, kind of sidelined for the most part, right to this century, running in two separate parts, okay? Two separate parts, never in the same part, okay? It is at the dawn of the 20th century, quite late in the 20th century, that some scholars began to entertain or, drive some viewpoints, of course, propounded by other scholars like historical people like Niels Bohr, of course, with the quantum theory, okay, as opposed to Einstein's classical theories, began to really bring out certain facts, and later on there were experiments that actually were able to prove the superiority of the quantum theory as to classical physics. And of course, it's an ongoing debate at this time, but still two separate parts, okay? Two separate parts. Science, atheism, and religious science. And within the different denominations, science is considered secondary to religion, and that kind of thing. So this is an issue, and I am one of those that believes that we must begin to give science a more serious position within the church, okay? Not in the terms of science now defining who God is, no, but beginning to make it a norm that we already know that science is inferior, and for that reason we must not try to pit it against God. No, we must deal with it as an inferior philosophy, but yet take it very seriously, because it is an act of God, and because of that we are mandated to deal with it the way it's supposed to be dealt with, like any other thing in this world, seriously, like the work that He has given us from the beginning of time, okay? And so this is my own view, okay, as I'm sure many other scientists, Christians out there. So this is the issue. The problem we have is that most people dump God when they get whether money or scientific breakthroughs, okay? So this is the problem that we continuously face, and there's a question, of course, what if a scientific fact comes out today that says that begins to bring doubt to the existence of God? These are issues that we must face, and of course these are the issues. That is why some of us are not mainline church theologians. Why? Because my view from the very beginning is that we must consider those facts seriously, even if it would lead to our loss of faith. Because if God is God, He should be beyond, He should be greater than our ability to lose faith. Okay? My God cannot be limited to my weaknesses. Okay? So if He was to give me work as a blessing, He would not curse that work or curse that work. So that it becomes a curse for me. Okay? It will continue to be a blessing as long as I put my trust in Him. And that is my own faith. Okay, I believe that many will agree with me. So this is the issue. So how do we do this now? Okay, how do we do this? How do we reconcile these two parts? What we need to do is there are two basic principles. Okay, one is a fallacy, the other is an academic skill. Okay, this academic skill can become a fallacy. Crediting authority. We cannot establish education and information and knowledge of the past without crediting authorities. Okay, these authorities are of course diverse and multiple. Okay, and so of course we cannot all credit all the authorities at one time, but we need to credit authorities in education, and that is very important. Every knowledge, there is nothing new under the sun. So credit to authority is very important. Now, at the same time, we must mature in defending and uplifting new knowledge, new findings, whether it's a hypothesis or a theory or established fact. We must be able to credit these things properly and recognize them properly. And that is what will contribute to the building of understanding and the building of knowledge over the centuries, and it will help the church. I believe it will help the church. It will help Christianity. And I know that many people disagree with this, and this is the problem that we are having, okay? And but we need to emphasize this as leaders in the church in this century to help people to grow and to move from ideologies that will send them the wrong way. We must push for this improving of knowledge and the development of knowledge through our own century into the future. I am David Tunji Chinki for you today in Searching the Heart.